Now, we heard about fishermen, didn't we, in that last reading? Does anybody here go fishing? No? Yes? Good. I'm glad some people go fishing here. Yeah? Lots of people like going fishing, don't they? What do you do if you catch a fish and perhaps you want to show it to your mate, but you don't want it to die, unless you want to take it home for your tea, of course? What do you do with it? Do you put it in some water? Brilliant. I knew somebody would get the answer. So you put it in a keep net, don't you, often, in the water, so that you keep it alive, yes? The fish need to be kept in water because they can't breathe otherwise. They'd just suffocate, wouldn't they, if you left them out of the water. Of course, commercial fishermen that go out to sea in the trawlers don't do that, do they? Because they're catching them for us to eat. So they don't put them in water, and of course the fish do die. Has anyone ever kept a goldfish? I bet loads of people have kept a goldfish. Nearly every child in Britain has kept a goldfish at some point. Do they live very long? No. Often they don't. Actually, goldfish can live a long time, but most of the goldfish we keep don't, do they?
No.
They don't. And that's for a very simple reason, really, is that mostly we get goldfish when we're quite young. So we're not quite sure how to look after them properly. And what really kills the goldfish is the water isn't kept clean enough, is it? So how many goldfish have you seen swimming around in a tank covered in green algae and the water smells a bit? Quite a few. I go around sometimes to people's houses and I always know when somebody keeps a goldfish. Quite a few are not kept quite the way that they should. Actually, goldfish are not as easy to keep as you'd think. So, unfortunately, they tend to have quite short lives, don't they? And it's not because we don't care about them, it's just that we don't have the knowledge to look after them. And the water ends up poisoning them, doesn't it? If we want to have a goldfish to have long, healthy lives, we have to take really good care of them and make sure that they have good quality water to swim around in, yeah? Of course, you have to do other things like feed them as well. That's quite good. You don't just have to rely on your mum to do it. You have to do it as well. So fish can be tricky things. Looks easy, but it's not as easy as it looks. Now, the guys we heard about in our last reading, they were called Simon, Andrew, James, and John. Their names we know today, aren't they? They're quite common names today. They were all commercial fishermen. That's it. They went out on a boat and they threw their nets in the water because they were going to catch fish for people to eat. And remember what I said about commercial fishermen? They don't try to keep the fish alive, do they? Because you don't want them alive if you're going to eat them, do you? No. So what was Jesus saying then? Why did he say, I will make you fishers of men? Does that mean he wants people to die? Because it doesn't seem to make sense, does it? Because that's what the people were doing with the fish. Well, I think Jesus was actually talking about fishing in the same way that we would think about keeping fish alive, not fish dying. If you let a goldfish swim around in dirty water for long enough, it's going to die, isn't it? And Jesus was saying, it's just like that for people. Do you realise that? If you allow people to stay in a world that is dirty for long enough, they're going to suffer and die. They'll become unhealthy and they may die. Bad things will happen to them. And that's a bit like being in dirty water, really, isn't it? And what Jesus is really thinking about is all the horrible things that happen to people. Because we know that we live in a world where there are wars, even now going on, aren't there? Wars are going on. People aren't being very kind to each other. People aren't having enough to eat. All sorts of things are happening which shouldn't happen. And that makes our world dirty. And Jesus said we are supposed to be working towards a time when actually those things don't happen anymore. And so it's like making the water clean for us as people so that we be healthy and we live long lives, and even when we come to the end of our lives, that we can claim eternal life with Jesus and God the Father. Now Jesus wanted to save the people of his day, and he wants to save us. And Jesus knew he couldn't do it on his own. All of the young people here today belong to groups, don't you? Yeah? And you know, the best way to achieve anything is to work together, isn't it? Yeah? If you try and go off on your own and do it by yourself, often things won't work, or they won't work as well. But if you work together in a group and you have a plan, sometimes you can achieve much bigger things, can't you? You can get to your objective. And that's what Jesus knew. He knew he couldn't just do it all by himself because he was just one. But with his disciples, he became many people. And he knew that he'd need those people to make this world into a better place. And he wasn't just calling people to be disciples then, he's also calling us to be disciples today. So he's calling every person who's sitting here to become one of his disciples to make this world into a better place. I don't suppose there's anybody sitting here who would disagree with making this world a better place, would you? No, we all want it to be a better place, and Jesus gives us a plan, a model of how to do it. Now, it must have been a bit of a surprise, perhaps, to these guys that Jesus comes up to them and he says, put down your nets, put down your business, leave your families, leave everything behind, and follow me. What would you do if somebody came up to you in the street and did that? Would you say yes or no? I wonder. So why did they say yes? Why do you think they said yes? That's a bit of a puzzler, isn't it? Because it's quite a big commitment, isn't it? Just to leave your family behind, your business behind, everything. I think most of us would do a bit of a double think on that one. But, do you know, maybe they did know Jesus. Jesus was a young man. He grew up in Nazareth. He was apprenticed to his father. Now, there's a bit of controversy here about whether he was a carpenter or actually a stonemason. Modern thinking is perhaps he was a stonemason. And stonemasons in those times often used to travel around to building sites, a bit like they probably do now. And so he'd have travelled around quite a bit. And as young men all over the world still do, in an evening when he'd finished his work, he perhaps didn't want to stay with Dad. He probably wanted to go off and chat to people his own age. Now, there were no nightclubs in ancient Israel, I have to tell you that. It's a bit of a disappointment, isn't it? But he'd meet up with young men around the area, and perhaps they'd do a bit of fishing together, and perhaps they'd barbecue a bit of fish, you know, on a campfire, and they'd sit around putting the world to rights. That's the sort of thing they would have done. And perhaps they'd have talked about their hopes and fears for the future. Perhaps some of the young men would have talked about they wanted to get married to their girlfriends, things like that. Perhaps they wanted to have a family, or perhaps they didn't just yet. Maybe Mum and Dad were putting a bit of pressure on them to get married and provide a few grandchildren, and they weren't ready yet. So they'd have talked about all these sorts of things. Now, they probably talked, because this was an important thing in those days, about what they believed about God too. So they'd have been sitting there chatting about all these things. And I think they'd have got to know Jesus as not just being a stonemason or carpenter or whatever he was with his dad somewhere, but actually as somebody who was very special and was already beginning to stand out as a leader of men. And so when he came to see them, they actually did want to follow. Jesus had just had some bad news at this point. His cousin, John the Baptist, who baptised Jesus in the River Jordan, had just been arrested by King Herod and thrown into prison. This effectively was the end of John the Baptist's mission to the world, preparing the world for Jesus to come. So Jesus knew that this was the time that he needed to start. So he needed to gather his team around him and start out on his mission into the world. So he goes up to them and he says, now is the time to act. All those things we talked about all those years, now is the time to act, and this is what we're going to do. Forget about fishing nets. Forget about fishing boats. We'll go out and catch people for God. Because the world has gone a bit wrong. And we need to put it right. And we have a plan to get there. Jesus was about to make it possible for us to be free of the dirtiness of the world and to come truly alive. Not just in the here and now, because we're all alive here, aren't we? Yeah? Everybody's breathing? Yeah, good, good. I'm just checking. Make sure you're all alive. Vaguely awake? Still good, good, good. That's a good sign, isn't it? But you're not just going to be alive now. Jesus says that even when we get to the end of our physical life, because everybody is born and everybody dies, that's just a fact of life, isn't it? Yeah? Happens to every single person. But he says it doesn't have to stop there. There is a part of us that is eternal. And if we follow Jesus, we can live forever. It's pretty good, isn't it? Do you like the thought of that? Living forever? I do. It's a pretty good thought, isn't it? When we realise this is how Jesus called his first disciples, perhaps we can begin to understand this is often how Jesus calls us. Not usually, all of a sudden, a fanfare, follow me. It's usually bit by bit by bit. And maybe we've heard as children, we've heard bits about Jesus. Maybe as young adults, we've heard bits about Jesus. And maybe it takes even until we become an adult, even quite late on in our lives, to realise Jesus is calling us. And that it's not something wishy-washy. It's not something that is just for little old ladies to do. It actually takes a lot of courage. It takes a real man of courage and a real woman of courage to be able to follow Jesus, because he actually calls us into some of the most dangerous places. He calls us into some of the most deprived places. He calls us into a world which is full of things that need to be put right. He calls us to serve. That's what he's calling us to. He's not calling us just to come to a nice church and sit down, sing a few songs, say a few prayers, and that's it. That's not what being a Christian's about. Being a Christian is actually about going out into the world and showing you're a Christian by doing what Jesus calls us to be. And that's what he's saying to us today. He's saying, you're going to need to be brave. You're going to need to take firm action to move out into the world and do what I'm asking you to do. Jesus was about to start something vital for this world. God had looked at the state of the world and said, what a mess. I need a firm rescue plan to stop these people who I care about from destroying themselves. He didn't want bad things to happen to us. He didn't want us to be separated from him. So he sent Jesus into the world to lead the mission. Now, if you're going to send somebody on a rescue mission, you want some sort of superhero, really. You're thinking, Jean-Claude Van Damme sort of thing. Maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's getting a bit long in the tooth, isn't he? That sort of thing. You're thinking superhero time. And you're thinking the team is going to gather around and they're going to be the best, aren't they? They're going to be the best. They're going to perhaps be the cleverest, the strongest, perhaps the most educated or the best fighters. Those are the sorts of people he's going to need in his team. So what does Jesus do? He goes and gets himself some half-literate fishermen. Is that a promising start? They don't have any formal education or knowledge to start with. Not a promising start. But perhaps you think the next ones he gathers in might be a bit better. They might be a bit better, mightn't they? Maybe they're just the foot soldiers, I don't know. And maybe the other ones are going to be the ones that bring the standard up. No. If you looked at all the other disciples that Jesus gathered around him, if today they were going to apply for a job, they probably wouldn't get to the interview stage, because most of them were a right mess. They weren't the sort of people you'd think of as building your team of superheroes up to come out and do wonderful things in the world. But do you know it didn't matter? It didn't matter at all, because they weren't going to do it themselves. They were actually going to be led by God. And with God's help, if you are willing to serve him, it doesn't matter how clever you are, how strong you are, or whether you're not any of those things. If you're willing to follow God, then he will give you enough strength, he will give you enough skills, enough ability to be able to do the things that are needed to be done in this world. That's amazing, isn't it? Absolutely amazing that that's what can happen. It doesn't matter whether we're very young, because very young people do things for God too. You might not be leaving home yet, but you can do things in the place you live in to make a difference to this world, can't you? I know you can. And it doesn't matter how old you are. Older people can do wonderful things for God too. It doesn't mean we don't have to be physically very strong or able. We actually can do wonderful things without that happening. As long as we're obeying God, he will do what's necessary. You might be saying to yourself, well, that was all loads of time ago, long, long time ago. Do we still need to be doing that today? Well, I think the answer is yes, because this world still isn't perfect, is it? Even in Harold Hill, there are still people who don't have a home, people who don't have somewhere to sleep at night. In Harold Hill, there are people who are going hungry, aren't there? And we go further around the world, there are people who are homeless, and the people who are at war, people who don't have enough to eat. It's a problem that's still all around us and still needs to have something done about it, doesn't it? And we're the people to do it. We're not powerless. Every single person here can actually make a difference. It might only be a little thing if you're very young, but as you get older, it might become a much bigger thing. Because there's some very able-bodied looking people in there. I think you can probably do a lot, actually, to make a difference in this community and in our world. We have to do it because too many people are still doing the equivalent of swimming around in a dirty goldfish bowl, and they're going to die. They need the opportunity to be in a clean world, don't they, so that they can live. Now, I don't know, has anyone here either seen the film or read the book about the Lord of the Rings? Seen the film? Yeah? No. Loads of us have seen that, haven't we? Yeah. If you haven't, read it. It's good. It's a good story. It's meant for adults, actually. Actually, it was originally written for adults. It wasn't actually written originally for children. I think the film's probably more aimed at a younger audience, but the book was actually written for adults. It's a very good story. It's a story of great struggle. And its lead character, Frodo Baggins, an unlikely name, I know, Frodo Baggins is set off on a dangerous quest, keeping one of the rings of power away from the evil Lord Sauron, who seeks to conquer the earth, and he needs the last ring to succeed. So there's a battle between good and evil going on here, all right? And Frodo realises that ultimately the only way to keep the power of the ring safe is to take it to a place to be destroyed. On this quest, he's accompanied by many unlikely companions, who, although they might not at first appear to be ideal, actually play a vital part in getting to him to his objective. And although he has to do the last bit on his own, he wouldn't have actually got there unless he was supported by the people who were around him. And that's a bit like us being disciples of Jesus. Jesus does the last bit for us, but we have to support him on the way. When God calls us to be Jesus' companions on the journey, to claim the world back from the devil who causes all evil in this world, we can't hesitate. Or we can't think someone else will do it, because actually the person who's the other person is you. It's the call on your life, not on someone else's life. And we need to ask him today, what do you want me to do, Lord? The fishermen had to leave their boats and nets behind and follow Jesus. And no doubt they had a few concerns about doing that, about how everybody was going to cope if they left them behind. But if they hadn't done it, what would the consequences have been? Amazing things happened then with just 12 people. Think what we could do today if we all sincerely wanted to make a difference in this world. Are you brave enough? Are you brave enough to do what Jesus calls you to do? Will you accept Jesus as your leader to lead you into the battle so that we can bring this world into a better place? Do you want to defeat all evil in this world? I hope we all do. Because none of us wants to live in a bad world, do we? We want to live in a good world. But if we do that, if we all join together to make this world a better place, then actually the kingdom of God moves closer and actually begins to move into this world so that we come into a place where the new creation occurs. And in the new creation, there will be no more war. There will be no more sickness. There will be no more separation. There will be no more illness. There will be no more of the dreadful things that make people's lives unhappy and really miserable. We will have come into the place that God wants us to be forever. Are you brave enough to follow Jesus? If you are, then let's get fishing and get ready. Amen.
Amen.